We could see no national boundaries, no vast gulfs or high walls dividing people.
We who are interested in the security of democracy.
As each side attempts to prove to the world the superiority of its position.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead because I've been to the mountaintop.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Good afternoon and welcome to this virtual program on the Cold War and popular culture. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society, and we are pleased to partner on this program with the UVA Club of Savannah. This conversation, the last of three with esteemed UVA faculty, is part of the Georgia Historical Society's Georgia History Festival, which this year is focused on the 75th anniversary of the beginning of the Cold War. Our guest today is Dr. Grace Elizabeth Hale. Dr. Hale is the Commonwealth Professor of American History and American Studies and American History at the University of Virginia, where she specializes in 20th century U.S. cultural history, the history of the American South, and the history of popular music. She is the author of 3 books, all critically acclaimed. Her latest is entitled Cool Town: How Athens, Georgia Launched the Alternative Scene and Changed American Culture, published by the University of North Carolina Press. This year, 2020, she is also the author of A Nation of Outsiders: How the White Middle Class Fell in Love with Rebellion in Postwar America, which we'll hear more about, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. And finally, her first book, Making Whiteness: The Culture of Segregation in the South, 1890 to 1940, published by Pantheon in 1998. Grace Hale, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us.
Stan, it's really great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to begin. This is a big topic. You and I talked about this before. This is a huge, broad topic. We could drill down in a lot of places. We're going to start very broadly. I'm going to ask you a question that's going to seem really broad, but it'll allow you to kind of take this wherever you want to. And then we'll drill down a bit. You've written extensively about post-war American culture and the ways that it has shaped and defined modern American life. Standing here in 2020 and looking back over 75 years since the end of World War II, how would you broadly describe the changes in American culture from, say, 1945 that had the greatest impact on our lives?
Well, I think the single most important thing is our idea of what culture is has been radically changed, and our sense of it as unified versus fractured. So when in the aftermath of World War II, Americans have a sense of themselves as having a unified culture. We could talk about all the ways in which that idea is not really correct, the people that are left out, the groups that are left out, but there is a broad understanding that has a great deal of power and authority in the world that there is such a thing as an American culture, and that is a unified thing. And in part, that's shaped by the experience of wartime, coming together to fight this global war, and the government's controls over culture during that time period. In part, it's shaped by the emergence of major corporations that dominate so much of what will later be called the culture industries, like radio, the radio networks, the big music companies, pretty after the war, the explosion of television and the 3 networks there. So in many ways, I think that Americans today have a hard time, especially younger Americans, the age of the people that I teach at UVA, having this understanding of a unified culture of something. There really was a mainstream. There was an idea of what culture was. Today, I think that is radically different. We live in a time period, and here I'm not just referring to the obvious partisanship that divides us today, but all of the various cultural niches, the fracturing, the fact that no single television show or a song or even a whole musical genre attracts the attention of the majority of Americans.
One of the things that strikes me as I think most peculiar about this period is, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like this is really the rise of the teenager in American history. That's a post-World War II phenomenon, is it not? And linked to all the things that you're talking about.
Well, I think like so much in America, what happens in that post-war period is what we might call a democratization of trends that are going on before. And so there is a kind of qualitative change, even when things aren't brand new in that moment. And the teenager's one of them. I mean, we absolutely have a kind of flowering of the idea of youth culture in the 1920s, but it's really limited to a pretty small group of Americans who have a kind of elite status, not even broadly across the middle class. And so that democratization of that idea of youth as a period of leisure, as a period of exploration and finding yourself, and even perhaps rebellion is something that really explodes in this post-war period. And it comes back again to that idea I started with, that there is such a thing as a kind of unified American culture, or at least people think there is. And that gives American teenagers in the 1950s, especially in 60s, something to rebel against that's very, very obvious. It is obvious to rebel against something that seems like it's so centralized and dominant as the culture that is brought to them by the network television shows, by their parents, by a kind of idea of a centralized American identity.
So one of the things it seems to me that happens over the 45-year period of the Cold War from 1945 to say 1990, 91, is this fracturing of American culture. It seems unified at the beginning. By the end, and this is long before the internet, of course, American society culturally has fractured a great deal. And of course, in many ways, led by what we might call the counterculture, which we can talk about a little more when we get to the 60s. But broadly, across that period, are a lot of people said, yes, this group that you're talking about, these teenagers grew up in the most affluent of all societies, probably in recorded history, the post-war American boom. And yet, by the 1980s, there is this sense of alienation. Is there not? I believe that even helped to create some of the alternative music scene that you've written about. Can you sort of take us along through that journey?
Yeah, I will. Absolutely. The one thing I want to say to start with, though, is that this idea of a unified American culture is something that is pretty unprecedented in the mid 20th century US. It hasn't really existed like that before. People's cultural interests and affiliations were set locally and to some degree also regionally before the rise of these big mass media companies. So, and big corporations even marketing consumer products. So I just want to set that up to start with. This is kind of an unprecedented time period of this unified culture. But yeah, the counterculture as it emerges in this period, young people, yes, many of the young people, at least as depicted within this mainstream culture, are affluent. We know, of course, that all Americans aren't affluent, but it is the period of the greatest, again, democratization of affluence in our society, or at least in the last 150 years of it. And so that is something that is key. But one of the things I think that we forget is just how radical it is to have the existence of the bomb, and how that creates a kind of alienation and something especially that affects young people. Growing up with this idea that human beings can destroy themselves completely, that is just really, really powerful for many young Americans, even affluent young Americans. This seems like a kind of dividing line, an unprecedented dividing line. And really, when we trace the history of countercultural rebellion and of youth rebellion to growing interest in civil rights protesting and anti-Vietnam War protesting, we really have to look at the roots of this rebellion, at least the political roots of it. It has other causes as well, in the invention of the bomb and what it means to live in a nuclear society.
Yeah, exactly. And that takes us back, of course, to the ideological struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union that dominated this entire period and really in some ways colored everything that we're talking about, all culture, all media. Can you sort of talk about how this ongoing ideological struggle with communism affected our culture? Everything from the movies we watch, the music that we listen to, the youth of America. Obviously, it's a huge subject. The draft and the proxy wars that came out of it that shaped our politics, our race relations, how we talk to each other, how we interacted. Basically, I'm asking you how all of this changed American society.
Yeah, no, it's a central theme of the period, and I want to stress that young people's sort of angst and their kind of alienation and being upset about the existence of the power to destroy human civilization it's not just narrowly political. It's more of an existential. It's bigger than political ideology. But your point is absolutely right. This Cold War contest shapes everything across this period. And Americans increasingly in this period, as the 40s turn into the 50s, understand their own sort of place in this fight as having a cultural definition as much as a political or economic definition. So if Americans think it's democracy and capitalism that make us different from the Soviet Union, what gives those fairly abstract terms meaning for most people is culture. It's their everyday life. It's the kind of house they live in. It's the kind of things that they have within that house. It's consumer goods and the explosion of consumer goods in this period, everything from televisions to dishwashers to, soon enough, air conditioners, all those kinds of things. It is also what's on television, what's playing on the radio. Americans understand their identity in this period as very much in those cultural terms, if that makes sense. That's how they see themselves as superior to the Soviet Union. So it plays a huge, huge role. On the flip side, it also creates a kind of dilemma, a kind of problem, or you might even say it's an opportunity. But for African Americans, for example, on the one hand, this dominant culture pretty much doesn't represent them. There aren't television shows that feature African American characters. There are radio programs. Actually, there are some television programs that do have African American characters, but they're very much indebted to minstrelsy, to the old traditions of blackface, to racist caricature. So they don't have a sort of representation in the broader mass culture in a positive way. But at the same time, the Cold War really provides them with a kind of opportunity for organizing, because if America is going to stand for freedom, whatever that means, whether that's the freedom to buy all the appliances you want or listen to whatever kind of music you want or to choose your own political representatives, African Americans have a place to put pressure. Right? They have a kind of global stage, if you will, that the Cold War gives them, and they can use that centralized vision of what American is against white Americans, to say, look, how can you possibly see yourselves as global champions of freedom when you are oppressing these folks who are Americans too, who have by every constitutional right that should have the rights of citizenship. So it becomes both a kind of problem, and also this unified culture is both a sort of problem for people. It's oppressive in its own right, but it's also a space or a medium in which people can apply pressure. And I think that's one of the major reasons we see the civil rights organizing exploding in this period and becoming so successful. It's not like African Americans haven't been protesting their oppression and their loss of rights throughout their entire history in this country. But what makes it so effective in the 1950s and 60s is exactly this unified culture and this Cold War battle. Those two things together. The fact that there is a centralized mass media that ignores them, but if they can actually get their issues, their stories into that space, which of course happens especially in this period through the new medium of network television news, then they have a way to communicate beyond the local gatekeepers, the regional gatekeepers, the racist white editors of newspapers, et cetera. On the other hand, there is a kind of way in which this dilemma excludes them. So.
Yeah, a lot to unpack in that answer. I mean, you touched on so many things that are part of this broad topic. I want to remind our audience listening that you can submit questions At the end of this, we will be taking questions from our audience. So please do that as you go along, as you hear things that interest you. The thing that you talked about there most, and I think had and again, you can disagree with me, that had the most impact across the entire era that we're talking about is the rise of television, network television, that unlike now, was pretty centralized in the message that it sent out. There were 3 networks for most of this period. Can you talk? Is it even, we could talk for an hour about just television and its influence, but its influence with the civil rights movement, its influence in politics, the way that it changed presidential politics, the way that it influenced the prosecution of the Vietnam War and covered the counterculture, all of that. Can you just talk broadly about how network television dominated this period and changed our lives?
Yeah, it's impossible really, I think. Well, maybe not impossible actually, as we now think about the way that social media has become so rapidly powerful in our own time. You know, that's actually a fairly decent model for thinking about the rise of television. I will add one caveat that that television as a new mass media form was highly regulated. So that would be one contrast, like social media today. But nevertheless, that rapid rise, most people don't remember that, you know, at the end of World War II, a few thousand Americans, very wealthy Americans, owned television sets. By the end of the decade of the 1950s, more than 2/3 of American households had television sets. I think the count is like 40 million or something of these television sets exist by that point. I may not have that number exactly right, but it's a rapid expansion. And it becomes the dominant medium of the age. And that, in some ways, that's sort of the best way to think about this strong, centralized, unified American culture, which again, we always need to remember doesn't include everything, but it is this kind of powerful, centralized force. And that just shapes everything about this period. But it is not just, it's sort of not inherently negative or positive. It works in both ways. And I think that's one thing that we always need to keep in mind. As I said, with civil rights, but also with other movements in this period, television provides a kind of central space to organize around, to try to get your message onto. And that actually has profound effects in shaping all kinds of social movements, starting importantly with civil rights, but expanding to other movements like the women's movement, the anti-war movement, the Native American movement, et cetera. You know, in some ways you could think about Trump's presidency as a kind of throwback to that. It too being shaped so much, not by network television, but by television as a medium. So it's really hard to underestimate the power and authority of television in this period, and especially of the television news. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why the Vietnam War is so central in this era in terms of changing and really expanding this kind of fracturing that's already beginning to happen before that, but really accelerating it. And that's because the television news is delivering, at least in the early days, the official government view of the Vietnam War. But people begin to see the kind of cracks in that story, and television becomes a major story in and of itself as some of the key famous journalists begin to actually sort of refuse to give that sort of central government version of the war, people like Walter Cronkite and others. So the television news becomes actually a news story in that way. But you know, I don't really know how to sort of delve into this in all of its many facets, except for to say that there's the power of TV in this period is so strong. Harkening back to your point about the teenagers, it really helps cement a kind of vision of the teenage years. The way that the teenage characters are depicted on television helps to sort of solidify that as a moment in life. It also plays a major role, even though radio is of course very powerful in spreading new musical genres, most importantly in this early period, rock and roll. And it's creating its sort of identity as a transgressive, rebellious genre. There have been plenty of those before, but again, television plays a key role here. It's hard to imagine Elvis Presley's fame without television. I mean, not that he wouldn't have been famous, but that mega stardom is not possible without television. It's again that paradox between a central culture and the way that it can create these spaces around the edges for people to rebel, and then also show us that rebellion, and then sort of incorporate that rebellion back into the kind of centralized whole. And television is the main medium doing this in this time period.
And I want to talk about music, obviously one of your great specialties that you've written about and in so many ways. But before I get there, just to continue with television, it not only had a monopoly on the news, and of course, one of the things we talk about in contemporary America is the breakdown, right, of trusted news sources in the medium in which we all live in now, where you can sort of choose your own news. But Americans in the 1950s and 60s, if you watched the news on television, you got it from three sources, and those became very powerful media figures. You mentioned Walter Cronkite. The other thing it seems to me is that television could do is dominate the entertainment that it fed Americans. I Love Lucy is a perfect example in the 1950s. The first show, if you will, like Seinfeld, about nothing, really, but so much still going on there. Can you talk about the power of television to create, and you touched on it there, talking about the way teenagers were portrayed, power of television to create a vision of America through the entertainment that it sort of force fed us for so many years before we could menu pick up what we wanted to watch?
You know, I think this is one of the things that's so fascinating about popular culture. And in some ways, television is really a pinnacle of this. And that is, for something to be really popular, it has to please a lot of people, and it has to have multiple possible meanings. It has to have a kind of ambiguity there, so that, you know, you might watch it, I might watch it, and someone else out in our audience might watch it, and we all come away with different things. And that has to be present for something to be a hit in a time period when there is so little supply, right? When these gatekeepers are really controlling what we get to see. There's only 3 television stations giving us not just the news, but any programming at all. And so in some ways that is really constricting and limiting, but on the other hand, it also provides this kind of way in which within each show, people have to think about creating different kinds of characters or different sort of episodes that explore different themes, or ways to bring in different kinds of members of the audience. It's not like the people creating those television shows assume everybody watching them is exactly the same, right? And so that creates this interesting tension. So on the one hand, there isn't as much of a breadth of representation. For example, you know, positive pictures of middle-class Black Americans, extremely rare. Like a hit show like Andy Griffith doesn't have a Black character that speaks a line until the 7th or 8th season. And this is a show set in the South, in North Carolina, that's being broadcast in the 1960s. So there is that problem. But on the other hand, because people can't tune on to something else, they can't find their niche, there is a way in which that puts pressure there to actually create more going on in each individual show, if that makes sense. More options, you know, a working class family that's appealing to middle class people, or vice versa. Something that's a hit, not just in a regional sense, but in a larger sense. There's no niche marketing, right? So that has a kind of broadening effect, even as the fact that there's so few shows is narrowing. So just like that works on the news, it works on everything that's going on in this time period. And I think it's harder and harder for Americans today to even wrap their mind around that cultural dynamic, because it's so different from our own, right? I mean, we all can watch whatever, well, not all of us, you have to have access to some sort of streaming device, but many of us with our phones, if not our computers, can watch, you know, any number of things all the time. As you said, any news sources. And so television really, in this period, especially the 50s and 60s, defines more than any other thing what America is.
And one of the things that we see in this period is what has been called the rise of the anti-hero. which touches upon not only television, but film, and is a bridge to music, I think. And we'll use this as a bridge to talk about music. You mentioned Elvis. I would put him in there. Marlon Brando, James Dean, and Elvis are the three, I think, greatest examples of the anti-hero. Can you explain a little bit about what that means exactly and how this phenomenon came out of an era that's kind of known for consensus?
Right. Well, it was like that dynamic I was trying to describe. It's the way in which the seeds of rebellion or resistance can happen within the medium itself. And so scholars begin in the 1940s and 50s to use the term mass culture to refer to what we're talking about, the mass media, commercialized, corporate controlled culture. And so the way that mass culture can provide a space for it critique of mass culture is one of its very interesting things. And the anti-hero is the perfect example of this. The growth of a character who personifies the critique, embodies the critique of the very thing that character is appearing in. So Elvis Presley, for example, on the radio, you might just mistake him for an African-American musician. And in fact, when his first songs are being played on the radio in Memphis, the local DJ actually has him on for an interview and asks him where he went to high school, because he knows that because the high schools are segregated, that will tell everyone hearing him that he is a white man. But it's not as clear, right? If you hear music, you don't necessarily know the race of the person performing it. And so that transgression of that boundary that's happening is not so powerful. But the visual of television makes that so powerful. When you see Elvis Presley on television, he's a wonderful anti-hero, and you see him dancing in this incredibly sexually provocative way, and you see him wearing clothes that people are not accustomed to seeing a young white man wearing. And even in some of his early appearances wearing eyeliner and makeup, we think of that as such a rock and roll thing. It's not, it goes back before that. So I'm sorry, of a later thing, 1970s rock thing. But that actually becomes so powerful when Elvis can be seen doing that. But outside the musical realm, you mentioned Marlon Brando, any character James Dean plays, in some ways, again, mass culture picks the safest bet, right? These are white male rebels and anti-heroes. But nevertheless, they are carrying that critique of the very thing they're in the middle of into that space, right? So the kind of critique of the sort of conformity of mid-20th century American culture, they're showing you that in movies that are appearing in major theaters that are made by the studios. They're showing you that on television shows that are on the 3 networks. So they're able to, this character of the anti-hero can bring that critique right into the space of the culture that it's critiquing in a very powerful way.
So let's talk about music, because this is obviously one of your specialties. You've written extensively about this. Elvis Presley, you mentioned, was heavily influenced by Marlon Brando, just the look, the sense of not seeming to even care about anything, even as he was, by some accounts, destroying American culture. What was it about music particularly? Because it seemed so radical and so dangerous in the sense that it challenged the dominant narrative of American culture, seemed to bring the races together. It did all sorts of things that frightened Americans. Talk about that, if you will, and the role that music played, challenging American culture, shaping American culture during the Cold War.
Yeah, I think the couple things about music that are really important to the way that it can still in our own time be such a kind of source of transgression, transformation, and rebellion. One of those things is that music is, compared to a movie or even a television series, it's pretty inexpensive to produce, relatively speaking. And it's something that people can produce without having access to all of the kind of resources that you would need to put on a television show or to create a film or some other cultural product in this time period. Increasingly, now that we all have phones that are cameras, you can make movies too. But in this time period, that was really off limits for people. So music has a really low barrier to entry, and it's also got a really low barrier to consumption, right? Popular music songs are short. It's not like you have to invest the amount of time it takes to read a book, to watch a movie. So even at the level of kind of the medium itself, popular music has really very low barrier to entry in terms of making it or consuming it. So that's one thing that's really powerful. The other thing is that the sort of inherent oral dimension of the music, the sound, there's something about the way that sound works, how it literally enters your body, how you can feel. If you really like music, you feel like you feel it in your body. Maybe it makes you tap your feet. Maybe you do what our family does, which is sing really poorly, loudly along to the lyrics. Maybe you sing better than we do, but there is a way in which music is very participatory, and it feels like it comes inside of you in the way that other kinds of cultural artifacts don't, if that makes sense. If you watch a movie, you don't feel like you're participating in the movie, even if you're drawn into it. You're not as likely to be. You don't know the words yet, so you can't. I mean, I guess if you watch the Sound of Music 6,000 times, you can do that. But I think all of those things really play a role in music's sort of existence as this space of transgression. But then really, really powerfully, there is the race issue. And as I've said before, there are two things about Cold War culture. It's the Soviet-US conflict, and it's on the domestic front, the white-black conflict. And both of those, sort of the external, conflict and the internal conflict, if we can sort of characterize them that way, are both super, super powerful. And music is a place where African Americans have long had a space in our culture, even when that culture has been defined by whites in racist terms. So the very foundations of American popular culture are in blackface minstrelsy in the early 19th century. And there's no escaping that. There's no escaping the fact that even when white musicians are playing pretty much anything that is considered to be American music in the 20th century, it has been shaped by African American musical production and sounds and styles. And so there's a way in which that question is always present, either more subtly or, in the case of Elvis Presley, it's right in your face. But it's just powerfully, powerfully present in the entire history of American popular music, the racial issue. And the fact that whites, long before many white Americans are able to accept African Americans and other aspects of American life as leaders or as pioneers or as the most important producers of something, they have that kind of success within the realm of music. And so there's a long, long tradition of that success as well. So all of those things, I think, really position music in this period as a space for imagining alternatives, for creating resistance to segregation, cultural resistance to segregation that has an interesting and important relationship to the political movements that are created to tear down segregation, and in helping to change at least some white Americans' minds about what should be the role of African Americans in American life.
And you've got musicians like Little Richard, like Chuck Berry, who are performing alongside, meaning, I don't mean literally, but at the same time as Elvis in the mid to late 50s. And it's really hard to overstate the influence that people like Chuck Berry and Little Richard had on white musicians that you saw 10 years later. Yeah. I know that, for instance, Little Richard heavily influenced Mick Jagger. Chuck Berry heavily influenced Keith Richards, and their influence goes on and on. Can you talk a little bit about that, this sort of borrowing from Black musical style that white Americans and, of course, white Europeans did so well?
Again, it's one of those stories, like everything, it so isn't new in the 1950s, but television and this kind of mass cultural industry, the culture industries really make it, expand it, make it more pervasive, make it more powerful. So, as I've said, whites are borrowing from, stealing from Black music across this entire 2 centuries, 19th and 20th century America. But what makes it so powerful in the period we're talking about is the increasing availability of the visuals. So, Elvis Presley is famous long before we get to see Little Richard or Chuck Berry very much on television. But at the same time, we do eventually get to see them on television. And, they bring not just the history that I've been speaking of, but also a kind of gender transgression into this space. I mentioned Elvis Presley wearing eye makeup. That's something folks like Little Richard are doing way back, even before there's something that we think of as rock and roll. And even though rock and roll is the sort of melding or blending of blues, rhythm and blues, country, gospel, there's white and black roots to rock and roll. It's not something that it has kind of integrated beginnings. Those gender transgressions that I'm talking about are so publicly, powerfully a part of the African-American side of rock and roll. And I think you see that so powerfully in Little Richard, obviously, but that's where Mick Jagger is getting that from. The way that folks like Mick Jagger are dancing around what we would maybe now call queer or androgynous, even before those terms are widely used, very much blurring that kind of boundary between masculinity and femininity. That is as transgressive, or perhaps just slightly less transgressive, but maybe the same as the racial transgressions at the heart of rock and roll. And those are really pioneered by African-American queer performers like Little Richard.
Talk a little bit about the way music really captured, the counterculture became really about music. In the early 1960s, Pat Boone is still at the top of the charts. If you looked at Billboard, and by 1969, you've got Woodstock. How did that transformation happen? And it really continued on after that. Popular music never really returned to the kind of Frank Sinatra, those very safe white stars that we saw at the beginning of the 1960s.
Yeah, well, one thing, one story we know is the one we've been talking about, of the invention of this kind of interracial mixed race rock and roll. But pretty quickly, the music industry figures out how to kind of tame rock and roll and create, turn it into a popular music financial juggernaut. And so the young folks looking for something different, something that is not part of this kind of mass culture of television and the 1950s and 60s, really begin to do that through the medium of folk music. And that is a really, really important part of how music becomes a defining aspect of the counterculture. It's not rock and roll as it first emerges in the 50s and becomes this commercial juggernaut, but it's rock and roll as reimagined, reorganized, redefined by the folk music revival, and most particularly people like Bob Dylan. But to get there is a long stretch, right? And one of the things that we really forget is how absolutely transgressive and radical folk music is in the mid 1950s, more so in some ways than rock and roll in this period. And that is because folk itself, the very word folk, has been tainted by McCarthyism, by red baiting. Most Americans forget that for a while, country music was called folk music. So country music had been called hillbilly music before World War II. And they were, country music folks were trying to upgrade their image, like, go up the class ladder. We don't want to be the country rubes anymore, cowboy and hillbilly music. That's too limiting. And so they chose the name folk music to be the genre that we now know as country music. But in the early 50s, they decided that was absolutely impossible. They had to jettison the name that they had very recently chosen to refer to their genre on things like the Billboard charts, because folk was communist. That was just horrible. The folk that's just the euphemism for the masses, right? The proletariat. We can't use that term. And so in this period, when young people are starting to listen to old music and discover like Library of Congress recordings, in the 1950s. A really important anthology that Harry Smith puts together comes out on this tiny label, Folkways, in 1951. But over the years, because Folkways is this little quirky label that keeps everything in circulation, by the late 50s and early 60s, this becomes really popular, the Folkways Anthology of American Folk Music, which is, unlike the Library of Congress recordings, the Folkways collection are it's music that was commercially recorded in the 20s and 30s. So hillbilly music, string band music, blues music recorded in that time period, but forgotten, lost, recorded by small labels, people that don't become famous. And so young folks, especially in college, but not entirely, begin to discover this old music. And that is really the beginnings of what we think of later as the hippie counterculture. It really starts with those folk music clubs, with those kids that are, again, their rebellion is about rebelling against that television culture, that suburban, middle class, white American future and present that is most powerfully shaped by television. And they rebel against it by digging up this old stuff that they begin to imagine as sort of more authentic, more real, somehow a way to free them from the kind of oppressive conformity of their own time and place.
Can you bring it all the way up into the 1980s? I mean, we see the rise of alternative music and punk. How is that influenced by the culture and the politics of the Cold War? How does it shape what we begin to hear in the mid 80s?
I think that the way that those are related is that, what eventually happens with the folk music revival and how it reshapes rock and roll, is that by the time you get into the 60s, folk rock has become the sort of center of the rock format. Dylan is the most popular musician in America. But as the 60s progress into the 70s, there is a feeling amongst young people that once again, the industry, the music industry, the corporations that put out most of the music have taken over rock and roll, have taken over what was supposed to be, quote unquote, our culture. And so punk is yet another, you could think of it as another round of the folk music revival. In some ways, it's another round of we got to figure out how to have our own culture that is not dominated by the corporations and by the mainstream media and by the sort of white middle class vision of America. And punk is really, people have this idea of punk as the Sex Pistols and as this British working class phenomenon, and that's absolutely true. But in America, punk is much more, has much less of a connection to a kind of vision of a sort of romanticization of working class life. And this is probably not surprising, given that that's not that strong a current in this American dominant culture anyway. But it's much more about artistic freedom and artistic self-determination, and what we might even think of as more of a kind of avant-garde rebellion than a kind of class rebellion. So key figures are people like Patti Smith, right? The Velvet Underground, the Ramones, these groups. And they create this vision of making your own music outside the realm of the industry, outside of the big companies, outside of television for sure. Heaven forbid we're not going to be on television. And so that really flourishes in the 70s in New York. And by the late 70s, and this is what my most recent book is about, Athens being a key site of this transformation, young people decide in Athens, and then that becomes a model for other places, that it's not just that punk music says anybody can play a guitar if you just learn to play 3 chords. It's that anybody can play anywhere. You don't have to move to New York or San Francisco. In fact, the most radical thing to do is to sit down right where you are and do it right there with your friends in that place. That is the way to actually create something authentic and to change the world around you.
I want to open this up now to our audience from some of the questions that they have submitted, and I have one here. Can you talk a little bit about the Red Scare and McCarthyism and how it affected the music and television and movies, the entertainment industry in general?
Yeah, that is one of those moments where this kind of unified, centralized culture of this period, as I said, very rare in the entire spectrum of American history in terms of its unification. That's one place in which this becomes a real problem, right? Because at the height of the Red Scare, the fact that the gatekeepers are terrified of bad publicity, they're really not so terrified of being in trouble legally as they are terrified of the bad publicity that McCarthy's accusations can bring them. And that has a real narrowing effect. One of the reasons why the folk music flourishes the way it does is that folk music revival in this period is that so many former, what people who are called the old left when you get to the 1960s, but the leftists of the 30s and 40s, because of the Red Scare, they really have to go underground. And one of the only ways in which they can sort of do anything that communicates anything of their old vision of their politics is in folk music, because that had been so much a part of the 30s and 40s left. And so people like Pete Seeger become kind of underground figures in this period, sort of keeping a little bit of that spirit alive and of those old networks of the left alive. And they really then help connect those people to the group that will become the new left. Excuse me. So that's what happens in music. But in television and in the movies, we see this kind of blacklisting effect, and the ways that people are afraid to push the boundaries, to make kind of anything that resembles an explicitly political, ideological critique of America for fear of being blacklisted, for fear of not being able to get work, for fear of being persecuted. And that has a really powerful effect. In some ways, though, that's bad for politics, but in some ways, it actually produces an interesting kind of transmutation of ideas that we probably should have been arguing about in the political realm into the cultural realm. Like back to our earlier discussion of the Antihero. That becomes a place to have a kind of critique that's in some ways a ventriloquism of something that might be more political in a more open space, right? But has to be translated into a kind of neutral cultural, kind of language to be able to pass muster in this moment of Cold War hysteria.
One of the other questions that has been submitted, we were talking about television and it's the huge influence it had. We didn't talk about advertising that you would see on television. Can you talk about television's impact on other industries, like things like advertising, but also on other media like newspapers, radio, and the role that television played in the explosion of media that we have today?
Well, one of the things that happens that we didn't talk about this when we're talking about music, but it's a real boon for the music industry, because radio no longer is not the space where you get your dramas, your soap operas, your variety shows. Radio was doing all of that from the 1920s on. All of that kind of variety that we see in 1950s and 60s television comes directly from radio. So as television rises, it's bad for radio's business model, but it creates a kind of explosion of a space for music to be circulated, right? Because no longer is, Amos and Andy, which is a blackface caricature of black people on the radio, goes to television. So now, all of those hits go to television, and that provides space for hearing and listening to more different varieties of music. If radio is going to survive, it has to figure out what can it be that television isn't. And in some ways, this is a return to some of radio's earliest moments, where a lot of radio was people performing live on the air. Now, of course, in the 50s and 60s, it's recordings, but back to where radio started, where it was more about music than about these kind of scripted programming. And that really is good for music. So that's one huge effect, right? Television completely changes the business model for radio. It changes the news as well. Newspapers too have a much greater they have to serve a greater variety of needs before the rise of television. To some degree, they've already been affected by the rise of radio. So you don't have as much, serialized drama in the newspapers as you did before radio. So some of that's already happening. And then television is another blow to that. And the newspapers become increasingly more about the news and less about other genres of entertainment, for example. So it really transforms everything that's happening in the period.
Including politics, of course. One of the things that we haven't really touched on, except to mention people like Marlon Brando and James Dean, that someone wants to talk about, is, of course, film, movies, what Americans saw on the big screen, and the way the Cold War influenced that, particularly, of course, the ideological struggle. The most famous films were things like Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove, in which the Cold War was front and center. But and what other ways did the Cold War, besides the most obvious, maybe affect what Americans saw on the big screen in the movie theaters?
Well, just like with television, it shapes the Cold War shapes what can be presented. But that's why a film like Dr. Strangelove is so incredible, because it is such a critique, right? You show it to students today and they really don't know what to make of it. But the kind of over the top satire tone of it, which, if you think about it, is some of what we get with like the way that politics gets translated by Colbert and by other, all those kind of daily shows. I mean, some of that in some ways would be our version, or the ways that certain kind of gifts from popular culture take on political meaning. But that is what Dr. Strangelove is doing in its time, right? It's so absurd and so kind of over the top that it can actually get away with the critique. I mean, not just of the bomb and of Cold War politics around nuclear power and the Soviet-US standoff, but also things like American racism, patriarchal oppression, gender discrimination, all of that's in Dr. Strangelove. That is, we could have spent the whole time here today talking about Dr. Strangelove. What an amazingly brilliant film. The scene, the iconic ending where he's riding the bomb down. I mean, it's just, people don't have to have seen it to have that image in their minds. So the Cold War has a tremendous effect on the film industry, but mostly it doesn't happen. Obviously the villains are often the Soviet Union in political thrillers. And, you can see, if you're old enough like me to have remember when the Soviet Union began to come apart and when the Berlin Wall came down, and then you can see the movie industry really struggling to figure out how to make a political thriller. Now, who's going to be who's going to be the enemy? There's a sort of searching about for the enemy that's going to fill the space of the Soviet Union. So that's a kind of obvious way in which the Cold War shapes the American film industry, but I think even more powerfully, it shapes the kinds of, it pushes these kinds of critiques or discussions that could be overtly political into other mediums so that they don't get censored. And that's a way I think that we don't think about that it affects the film industry.
How does television change over time? One of the questions is how television changes over time. It goes from being very saccharine, kind of Leave It to Beaver, as you said, the model family. This is how teenagers act. And you get All in the Family in the 1970s, which was groundbreaking on so many different levels. Can you talk a little bit about how popular culture adapts itself over time, as the medium still sort of controls entertainment, but at the same time, it adapts itself to a changing America that might be more open to discussion or seeing things and people on TV that don't look and sound just like they do?
Yeah, and that is one of the things, I think, that central tension we've sort of been discussing this entire period of this talk, is that it's that tension, because television is such a centralized medium through the entire Cold War era. It either has to figure out a way to bring in controversial issues or to somehow bring in groups that have been marginalized or been pushed to the edges of it as a medium, or risk losing large parts of its audience, right? There's only 3 networks. So you have the protests against the Vietnam War reaching, it's the largest anti-war movement ever in American history. So how is television going to deal with that? I mean, and All in the Family provides a model of dealing with it that's really quite brilliant because you have a family with people of different ages and who have different perspectives on what's happening in the world. You can model different positions or show your audience different places they might find themselves, different characters they might identify with. So that way you're trying to bring in those young folks protesting the war into your business, into your audience, right? As make them part of your audience, rather than have them just reject you completely, but at the same time not lose their parents' generation or Americans who actually support the war. And so All in the Family is groundbreaking because it is the first time you see that kind of characters embodying and voicing a kind of powerful anti-war position. But even in that show, you see them opposed by the father, by the patriarch, by characters that don't agree with that position. And that's what television as a centralized medium can do. And that's how it tries to adapt to changes in America. By the sitcom model works really, really well because you can create groups of people where you can imagine different positions, right? Different characters with different beliefs. That's why, in fact, though, the news does a better job of covering African-American issues than the space of television drama because of the deep segregation in American life. It's harder to bring Black characters into a sitcom situation, right? Because of our segregated neighborhoods, because of segregated families, because of the way their race divide is so powerful in people's domestic and private lives. And so that provides a different kind of challenge there.
So last question, I'm going to ask you to put your historian's cap on. We both in grad school used to get the question, so what? So here we are 75 years later in contemporary modern America, right on the cusp of 2021. How did the Cold War change American culture in a way that we're still living it today? What do you think the most important impact is?
I think it's an impact that you still see, it sort of ebbs and flows, but it is this idea that to have a critique to have a critique of certain ideas about America is anti-patriotic, and it makes you not an American, and thus there's no grounds for a discussion. There's a way in which, for all of our partisanship today, we really don't want to have political debates. We don't actually have debates. We don't have a robust culture for having discussions across a vast space of political difference. The Cold War created a certain kind of Cold War liberalism as our dominant political model. And that's all we could that's the only place we could have a kind of political discussion within the boundaries that the Cold War set up. The boundaries today are different about what kind of political discussion we can have. And I would argue they've moved in domestic ways, especially, they've moved to the right, even as maybe in some international ways they've moved in the other direction. But we could debate exactly how they've changed, but the boundaries are different. But yet our unwillingness to really have a political discussion, an explicitly political discussion across the spectrum of possible political possibilities, seems to me, for all the ways in which our culture is so different from Cold War culture, so fractured, so many sources of information, entertainment, so many niche markets that we all divide up into, that has stayed the same. This kind of lack of a sort of ability to have like a real debate about a wide variety of political options.
Grace Elizabeth Hale is the Commonwealth Professor of American Studies and History at the University of Virginia. Grace, thanks for joining us and for a terrific program.
Oh, this has been really fun, Stan. Thanks for having me.